I've been thinking about this weird feeling I used to get at the end of some months. Nothing dramatic happened. No overdraft. No angry email from the bank. All the bills cleared. The budget technically worked. And yet I'd look at my checking account and feel this quiet disappointment I couldn't explain. I didn't blow money on anything stupid. I didn't go on a spree. It just felt thinner than it should have. I remember telling myself it was probably gas prices, or groceries being weird again, or just one of those months. That explanation usually worked well enough to stop me from looking any closer. What bothered me later was realizing how often that happened without setting off any alarms. When something fails loudly, you react. When it fails politely, you just adjust your expectations downward and keep going. That's the part that stuck with me. The budget didn't break. It just quietly stopped helping, and I didn't notice right away. One thing I didn't see happening at the time was how normal it kept shifting without asking permission. The budget I was using made sense for the version of my life I remembered, not the one I was actually living. Takeout used to be a once-a-week thing. Then it was twice. Then suddenly it felt reasonable 3 times a week because the days felt longer and my patience felt shorter. A lunch that used to be $12 somehow became $19, and I never really questioned it. None of that felt irresponsible. It felt earned. The budget didn't crack because each change was small enough to justify on its own. I remember defending those choices without even realizing I was doing it. I kept saying my budget was realistic, even as my spending quietly voted for a different reality. Looking back, that's uncomfortable. Not because the spending was outrageous, but because I let the definition of normal change while pretending the plan still meant the same thing. Another thing I didn't account for was energy. Budgets are usually written when you're calm, fed, and a little optimistic. Real spending happens when you're tired, hungry, and just trying to get through the day. I remember setting numbers on a Sunday afternoon, feeling organized, feeling like I had things under control. Then Thursday night would roll around. I'd get home late, stand in the kitchen, and stare at the fridge like it had personally betrayed me. The plan said I had food. My body said I was done. So I'd spend $18 on delivery instead of the $6 meal I'd planned. Every time, I told myself it was an exception. But exceptions that happen every week aren't exceptions anymore. The budget didn't fail because the math was wrong. It failed because it assumed I'd always show up as my best, most disciplined self. And most days, I just didn't. I used to lean really hard on this phrase. It's only a few dollars. $4 extra on coffee, 3 times a week. That doesn't feel like anything until you say it out loud and do the math. $4 3 times a week is about $600 a year. That's when it starts to feel different. What made it uncomfortable wasn't the number itself. It was how often I'd use that phrase to protect myself from noticing patterns. I used it everywhere. Upgrades, convenience fees, slightly nicer versions of things, each one small enough to ignore. Together, they quietly reshaped my cash flow. The budget didn't flag it because nothing crossed a line. No single purchase looked irresponsible. The discomfort came later when I realized how many times I'd said only a few dollars without ever adding them up. Subscriptions were another blind spot for me. Not the big ones I actually used, the quiet ones. The $10 here, $15 there charges that just blended into the background. I remember scrolling through my bank statement and recognizing everything without really feeling any of it. I'd signed up during free trials, meaning to cancel later. Later never came. 5 subscriptions averaging $14 a month doesn't sound scary. That's about $800 a year. Not enough to cause panic. Enough to cause drift. What bothered me wasn't that the services were bad. It was that they'd become invisible. The budget had an entertainment line, but it didn't capture the emotional numbness of spending. I'd stopped noticing altogether. When money stops registering emotionally, it doesn't feel like spending anymore. It feels like background noise. I also had this category in my budget that I told myself was smart. Miscellaneous, buffer, other. The place where small overruns could land without causing stress. At first, it really did help. Then slowly, everything started ending up there. coffee that ran over, random fees, convenience costs I didn't plan for. The category grew, and I stopped asking what was actually inside it. As long as the numbers still balanced, I felt fine. Looking back, that category wasn't flexibility, it was avoidance. It was a place I built specifically so I wouldn't have to look too closely. The budget didn't fail because I didn't have room for mistakes. It failed because I created a space where the truth could hide without bothering me. Credit cards made all of this quieter. When money doesn't leave your account right away, it doesn't feel real in the same way. I'd put something on a card and tell myself, future me would deal with it. Future me always did, just not happily. The budget stayed calm because the checking account stayed calm. Then the statement would show up heavier than I expected. Carrying $3,000 at around 20% interest is roughly $600 a year just to stand still. No new stuff, no progress, just treading water. What made that uncomfortable wasn't the debt itself. It was realizing how much I liked the delay. Credit cards didn't just smooth cash flow. They softened consequences. And the budget went along with it. Most budgets are built on averages. Average grocery month, average gas costs, average spending. Life doesn't really do averages. Some weeks you drive more. Some weeks you eat out more. Some months just cost more for no clear reason. I remember feeling frustrated with myself for being inconsistent, when the real issue was expecting consistency from something that never offered it. Each weird month felt like bad luck. Stack enough of those together and it becomes the rule. The budget wasn't wrong on paper. It was just too polite to argue with reality. That quiet mismatch between plan and life slowly wore me down, even though nothing technically failed. There was a point where I stopped checking my budget mid-month. Not on purpose. It just happened. The first week looked fine. The second week was a little worse than planned. By the third week, I already knew what I'd see. Slightly over, not catastrophic, just disappointing. So I avoided it. I told myself I'd look later. Later turned into next month. Avoiding it felt easier than adjusting my expectations again. That's when I realized the silence wasn't confidence. It was fatigue. The budget became something I only wanted to see when it behaved. And when it didn't, I looked away. At some point, budgeting became part of my identity more than my outcome. I had the app. I updated categories. I felt like a responsible person. There was comfort in that. Even when the results weren't changing, the process made me feel like I was doing the right thing. Looking back, that's uncomfortable to admit. The budget became a performance. Not for other people, just for me. I didn't want to question it because questioning it would mean admitting that effort doesn't always equal progress. And that's a harder thing to sit with than a slightly tight month. I remember getting a raise and waiting for relief. Not excitement, just breathing room. It didn't really show up. The money came in and somehow it disappeared just as quietly. Groceries got a little nicer. Delivery felt easier to justify. Coffee turned into the better coffee. A $300 monthly raise is $3,600 a year. Mine vanished without leaving much evidence behind. I didn't splurge. I drifted. That was the uncomfortable part. The budget expanded, but so did my baseline. It didn't protect the raise because it never questioned how quickly a little nicer becomes normal. This is the part I didn't want to look at first. Convenience, delivery fees, upcharges, paying extra to save time or energy. I told myself it was survival. Some days it was, but I avoided adding it all up. Not because I thought it was wrong, but because I knew it worked too well. When I finally did the math, it wasn't shocking. It was steady. A few $100s a month, thousands a year. That's when it hit me. The budget hadn't failed here. I had opted out of looking because I didn't want to feel the weight of knowing. Boredom spending was quieter, not emotional blow-ups, just idle scrolling purchases, snacks, apps, little treats. I remember nights where I spent $25 and couldn't tell you what on. Twice a week like that is over $2,500 a year. What made that number uncomfortable wasn't the amount. It was how forgettable the spending was. The budget didn't have a category for boredom. It didn't know how to track money spent to fill empty moments. I wasn't buying things I needed. I was buying something to do, and that kind of spending leaves no memory behind. I also learned that fixed expenses aren't actually fixed. Rent stays the same, sure, but utilities creep. Insurance ticks up. Internet adds fees, each increase small enough to ignore. I treated them like temporary annoyances, even when they never went back down. The budget stayed the same while reality slowly moved. Over time, that gap became pressure, not panic, just constant, low-grade pressure. Looking back, I wasn't careless when I was passive. And passivity adds up in its own quiet way. There's a mental cost to all of this that never shows up on a spreadsheet. Thinking about money takes energy. When the budget started feeling like work instead of clarity, I disengaged. I didn't quit. I just stopped feeling helped by it. That's when the exhaustion really set in. Not dramatic burnout, just a sense that I was carrying something heavy without getting relief. The budget didn't fail because I lacked discipline. It failed because it became another thing asking for attention when I had very little left. I used to compare my numbers to other people's lives, not online, just casually. Hearing how someone managed on less and wondering what I was doing wrong. Their budgets didn't match my reality. Different commutes, different schedules, different energy. Instead of questioning the comparison, I questioned myself. That quiet self-doubt stuck around longer than any overdraft ever would have. The budget didn't fail because I was bad with money. It failed because it borrowed expectations from lives that weren't mine. There was a whole year where I stayed almost fine. No emergencies, no big wins, just stuck. Being short $200 a month doesn't feel dramatic. That's $2,400 a year of nothing changing, no progress, no cushion, just treading water. That's when I realized budgets don't only fail by creating debt, they fail by preventing momentum while convincing you things are okay. That kind of failure doesn't show up in alerts. It shows up in time passing. At some point, I noticed I was adjusting the budget to protect my comfort, not to reflect the truth. Categories shifted to fit habits I wasn't ready to question. It felt reasonable in the moment, flexible even. Looking back, it was negotiation. I wanted the budget to agree with me, and when it did, I felt better, even if nothing actually improved. The failure wasn't the numbers, it was the quiet agreement I made with myself, not to push too hard. The strangest part was feeling bad at money without evidence. Nothing was on fire, the bills were paid. Still, I carried this low-level shame I couldn't explain. Quiet budget failure creates that feeling. The plan doesn't get feedback, it just goes quiet. And in that silence, your brain fills in the story, usually a harsh one. That stuck with me longer than any actual mistake. I still remember checking my account near the end of a month and seeing $417 when I expected closer to $700. Nothing broke, everything cleared, but the number felt wrong, not alarming, just heavy. The budget didn't fail loudly, it failed politely. And that's the part that took me the longest to notice.